Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Skyscanner is possibly Pauper playable. Skyscanner is a brand new artifact creature that was released with Core Set 2019. The reason it's so exciting is because we've never had a spell that only costs generic mana, replaces itself when it enters the battlefield, and can begin attacking your opponent with evasive damage. I probably won't have to try very hard to convince you that playing 3 mana 1/1 flyers isn't a very good idea for the Pauper format, even if they do draw a card when they enter the battlefield. However, I do see some potential in Skyscanner, so I built a deck around it that focuses on making it as inexpensive as possible while taking full advantage of its ability to attack over your opponent's board with evasive damage. I'm calling this deck Sculptor Skies because it revolves around slamming an early Ethereum Sculptor and accelerating into big artifact creatures with flying that also have useful enters the battlefield abilities. Ethereum Sculptor costs 1 and a blue for a 1/2 Videlkin Artificer, and it allows us to cast all of our artifact spells for 1 generic mana less. This is an incredibly powerful effect because it's different than ramp. We can use this cost reduction as many times as we want in any given turn, so if we get 1 or 2 Ethereum Sculptors down, we can start chaining Skyscanners until we have a board that's full of them. Reducing the cost of our creatures is crucial to our plan. That's why I've included another accelerator to make sure that we can explode onto the board before our opponent has a chance to react. This is Warden of Evos Isle. It costs 2 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and it allows us to cast all of our creature spells with flying for 1 less generic mana. Having extra copies of accelerators ensures that we'll have at least 1 on board at all times, even through all of our opponent's crazy interactions sending our other acceleration creatures to the graveyard. Even if our redundant copies of Ethereum Sculptor in the form of Warden of Evos Isle don't work out, we've even hedged for it again with our first artifact flyer that we're trying to reduce the cost of. This is Sanctum Gargoyle. It costs 3 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This is Sanctum Gargoyle. It costs 3 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Not only does this allow us to buy back an Ethereum Sculptor or a Skyscanner that our opponent has dealt with, it also synergizes really well with the rest of the artifacts in our deck. All of our artifacts have enter the battlefield abilities, or they do something when you sacrifice them, so buying them back with a Sanctum Gargoyle is always going to be a good bit of value. Our other artifact creatures with flying also replace themselves when they enter the battlefield. Take Fairy Mechanist for example. It costs 3 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This creature is definitely overcosted, but when you're casting it for 1 blue mana, it almost seems broken. Also, if we don't have an Ethereum Sculptor on board and we have to clunk our way up to 4 mana, we can start casting these Mechanists and trying to find a Sculptor to really start exploding. Our last artifact creature with flying can get all the way down to 0 mana with its Thopter friend Skyscanner. This is Pilgrim's Eye. It costs 3 generic mana for a 1/1 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Even though our deck doesn't require a ton of mana fixing, Sanctum Gargoyle and Fairy Mechanist still require either a white or a blue source to be cast, even after their cost has been reduced all the way down. Pilgrim's Eye is going to make sure that we have enough plains and islands on the battlefield to have really explosive turns where we're just casting gargoyles and mechanists like crazy. This also allows us to cheat on our mana base a little bit so that we can include more artifacts in our deck. That means when Fairy Mechanist enters the battlefield and lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library for an artifact card, you have a higher chance of finding one. Next, I'm going to talk about the rest of the artifacts we plan to reduce the cost on with our Ethereum Sculptors. First, we have Alchemist's Vial, which costs 2 generic mana, but in our deck often costs less than that. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice it and make it so that a creature can't attack or block for a turn. Alchemist's Vial is used to falter flyers and other archetypes like Boros Monarch. This helps Boros Monarch maintain the Monarch status, but for us, we're planning to falter our opponent's flyers so that we can attack for lethal. We're also running Prophetic Prisms. They cost 2 generic mana, and when they enter the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 and tap them to add 1 mana of any color. Like I've said before, this deck is deceptively hungry for colored mana sources, so while it already synergizes really well with Ethereum Sculptor, it also provides us that extra blue or white to get our gargoyles and mechanists down. down. Our last card draw spell goes along perfectly with our theme of cost reduction and artifacts. It's Thoughtcast. It costs 4 and a blue, but it has affinity for artifacts, which means it'll cost 1 less for each artifact you control, and we're going to control a lot of artifacts. It draws 2 cards. Given that most of our permanents have powerful enters the battlefield abilities, I've also included Core Skyfisher, which costs 1 and a white for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. We're not really looking to interact with our opponent and go into a long game. We're trying to explode onto the board with flyers and attack for lethal damage. However, sometimes our opponent's board state is going to get in the way, so I've found some synergistic interaction to deal with those situations. First, we have Aether Spellbomb. It costs 1 generic mana, usually 0 in our deck, and you can pay 1 to sacrifice it and return target creature to its owner's hand. You can also pay 1 generic mana to just sacrifice it and draw a card. Ideally, we're going to get our opponent's 1 big butt flyer out of the way with this Aether Spellbomb and then swing in for a ton of damage, but in a pinch, if the board's stalled out, we can return one of our own mechanists to replay and dig a bit deeper for another card we need. Another spicy one-of we have access to is Aethersworn Shield Mage. It costs 1 white-blue for a 2/2 with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, prevent all damage that would be dealt to artifact creatures this turn. Sometimes it's going to take more than 1 Alpha Strike to get around our opponent's flyers and win the game. When you're holding an Aethersworn Shield Mage, you can make that flunge fearlessly because you can just flash an Aethersworn Shield Mage and make sure you don't lose any of your board state. Our last flashy one-of is a Miser's Rally the Peasants. It costs 2 and a white and gives creatures you control +2/+0 until end of turn. You can also flash it back for 2 and a red, which means you may cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. I have Rally the Peasants grouped in with the rest of the interaction, even if it can win the game on its own. Sometimes it's just going to act like another copy of Aethersworn Shield Mage. We get to flunge our board into our opponent's flyers. If they block, we're going to make sure that all of our 1/1s trade up. Our last non-land card is Journey to Nowhere. These synergize really interestingly with Core Skyfisher, and it always feels good to have a few catch-all removal spells in your deck. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base. We're only running 20 lands because we're hedging a bit with our Pilgrim's Eyes. We're running 3 Ancient Dens, your white artifact lands. They're artifacts, they're lands, and they add white mana. We're running 4 Seed of the Synods, your blue artifact lands. They're artifacts, they're lands, and they add blue mana. Lots of artifact lands to turn on our Thoughtcasts. We're running 3 Azorius Chanceries, your blue-white Karus. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you return a land you control to your hand, and when they become untapped, they add blue and white. We're running 2 Secluded Steps, your white cycling lands. If you're flooding out and you draw this, you can just pay white, pitch it, and draw a new card off of the top of your deck. We're also running 2 Tranquil Coves, your standard Pauper duels in blue and white. They enter the battlefield tapped, gain you a life, and when they become untapped, they add blue and white. Finally, we have our basics: 2 plains, 3 islands, and 1 mountain. We want to be able to tutor up colored sources with our Pilgrim's Eye, but we can't run too many because we're running as many artifact lands as our mana base will permit. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. We've got 2 Fragmentize, just in case our opponent wants to put a creature under a Journey to Nowhere. We'll destroy it and get that enter the battlefield trigger again. We have a Serrated Arrows for killing tribes and maybe killing a few fairies along the way. We have a couple of Sunbeam Spell Bombs to gain life in the burn matchup and get bought back by those Sanctum Gargoyles. We have 3 Hydroblasts for blowing up any red threats. We have 2 Echoing Truths for Core Skyfisher decks. They get in the way in a really bad way, so we want to bounce them all at the same time and attack for lethal before our opponent can commit them again. We have 2 Prismatic Strands for those green, red, and blue decks that try to use Alpha Strikes to win themselves, and we also have 3 Standard Bearers for when our opponent is trying to boggle up or cast a bunch of pump spells. And there it is, Sculptor Skies. I'm going to take this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince this Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time. I'm there every Tuesday night playing possibly Pauper playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Tuesday night.